Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Western Washington reporter, Spencer Pauly, here to talk about two bills that the Seattle Land Use Committee just fast-tracked amid ongoing budget challenges that they have. Apparently, these bills are supposed to align the city's permitting review process with the state's in an effort to boost affordable housing. Spencer, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what these bills really do?
Sure. So we're focusing in on two city council bills here that are set for an expedited vote soon, I should just say, at the time of this recording. But basically, these two bills amend the city's municipal code and existing building code. And the goal is to limit these hurdles for housing construction. So the first bill aligns Seattle's permit review process with the state's default project permit review timeline. Now, what this does is it basically fixes these delays in projects. So this means that, the permit review process can just slow down housing construction and ultimately economic growth. That's an issue that Seattle has flagged, and not only is this Seattle City Council Chair Sarah Nelson's proposal, but aligns with a lot of what the mayor, Bruce Harrell, has been working to do, which is just cutting the fat on this design review process in order to build up affordable housing at a faster rate. It's no surprise, and something you and I have talked about multiple times on this show about Seattle's lack of affordable housing. Now, by cutting this permit review process, this expedites the construction, right? And this is what Nelson said about this proposed bill, is that these delays can jeopardize the financing of these projects because, the banks want to know when they're going to get to return on their investment. So that bill is going to be voted on here soon at the time of this recording. I should note that both of these bills had a unanimous do pass recommendation from the city council. So I think I can say pretty confidently that they will be ultimately approved here. Now, the other bill it amends Seattle's construction codes, and it limits the areas for which these substantial alterations can be required to buildings greater than 7,000 square feet in gross area. Now, when you look at these bills and the summaries and the fiscal notes, basically what you find is that if the permitting volume remains stable in Seattle by 2030, this legislation, they estimate, could support the reactivation of more than 50 small commercial tenant spaces by reducing the time-consuming regulatory barriers. Now, this goes along with what I was saying, how this just speeds up the process here, and we're trying to build affordable housing at a faster rate. But, of course, that comes with some downsides, right?
Yeah, it sounds like they want to take a bunch of, say, the vacant commercial spaces and other businesses that have since emptied in the last few years around Seattle and kind of convert that into affordable housing. I've heard a lot of municipalities trying to do this, whether it be Seattle, Spokane, and other areas around the state and country. This sounds like a great idea. I mean, so they're essentially taking their permitting process and shortening the length of review. I saw that there was 3 different types of permits in your story. We don't need to get into the nitty gritty of each, but it essentially takes that time period down to the default at the state. Now, I wonder what impact that might have. I mean, is this pretty routine? Is this something that they might miss out on things like crime trends, other impacts to the city through this review process? Kind of a few things to consider there, right?
Well, let's talk about crime trends, because there's like this public perception that with affordable housing comes maybe crime, right? It's kind of an awkward thing to bring up, but it is a flagged potential that the public thinks about. But I found research about this. So affordable housing reduces crime by stabilizing families and curbing homelessness. Now, this aligns with what we've talked about countless times is it about homelessness in general. Is it a housing problem or is it a substance abuse problem? Now, this is the sales study I looked at. So obviously they're looking at that housing prevents people from committing crimes because they just have a roof over their heads, and that if they just have any kind of housing, that there's no crime uptick. And that's what the data shows within Seattle. Now, this is from 2020 where I found this. So who knows what's changed since COVID, right? Over 5 years ago. But that's what I found. But still, I think that is something to consider. you're seeing a lot of Seattle neighborhoods, especially with higher income, sweated out about maybe having more affordable housing within their neighborhood. And that's something I think we should think about when we, fix this design review process and we see more and more affordable housing getting built at a faster rate. Now, I think, Tim, we talked about crime, of course, but there's also the other issue, not necessarily an issue, but when we're seeing more permits, you're getting more cash to the city. Mm-hmm. The Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, 90% of their budget comes from user fees, not taxes. So that means these permits generate more fees. So what you're seeing is they're teeing up a permitting boom to juice the department's fee haul. And this is right before any kind of budget knife drops because the city's dealing with a budget deficit. So, with 90% of the department's monies coming from builders, you're getting a lot of short-term cash. But we have to think about the safety lapses with just the fast and design review process. Tim, these process were here in the first place to prevent any kind of disaster from these buildings. And so you might see recalls or higher insurance rates. And so that's going to set up tomorrow's problems.
Yeah. And you said one of the bills would essentially limit the amount of renovations that's done on, say, these big commercial spaces that are already existing, 7,000 square feet or more. I mean, some of these buildings could be decades old. And when you rush this permitting review process, maybe say you miss something in terms of safety that you would have caught with a longer permitting review process. And then now these are hiccups or say issues with these units that tenants are going to run to when they get into them.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah, I think also, Tim, this is something I just see personally in Seattle is you see core like blocks and blocks transition from an old house to something new. And a lot of these modern buildings look very stale, maybe is the best way to phrase it. They all have that same kind of modern look. And just based on my own observations, it looks like it's cheaply made, cheaper quality wood. And that's going to cause issues within 10 years. So a lot of these developers are creating this kind of housing, profiting off of high rents. Seattle is continuing to see rent increase and increase and increase. Now, if they have to dedicate a certain amount of their units to affordable housing, that's one thing. The majority of their housing goes towards higher income. And so this is just going to be a city full of issues with their housing in 10 to 20 years when that quality material starts to deteriorate. And so I think a lot of this is something to consider when you're seeing these fast and design review periods and you're seeing more and more affordable housing being built. Now, these buildings, as big as they are, they can be built within 6 months. I've seen it. And that's telling you enough that a lot of this is just kind of cut and paste and cheaply made. I think it's going to be an issue here, Tim.
Yeah, it really seems like Seattle's kind of got a double-edged sword here. I mean, on one hand, they have the homelessness crisis, and a large portion of the city's workforce lives outside of the Seattle just because of how expensive it is to live there. But on the other hand, I mean, in trying to fast track this affordable housing, you risk creating an overcapacity, building too much affordable housing. And I know studies might say, it doesn't lead to increases in crime, but, when you do build lots of affordable housing, you invite certain aspects of crime to that area just through those lower rates. Not to say that everyone that's low income is seeking to commit crimes, but that's just the reality of the situation. But
it's definitely perception. It's the public perception there, Tim. And it's something obviously it's on the radar for a lot of Seattle neighborhoods, especially people who have lived in their neighborhoods for decades, right? And then you start seeing these affordable housing. People are afraid of seeing their neighborhoods turn to crime-ridden. It's definitely a concern and something that I will definitely keep an eye on in the future here, pending this the approval of these two bills, which, Tim, I'm pretty confident is going to happen here.
A Center Square reporter in the White House asked President Donald Trump earlier this week whether he'd be open to the possibility of potentially designating groups like Antifa that have a large presence in Oregon and Washington state as a domestic terrorist organization. He said, I'm 100% open to the possibility. Carlene, you talked to a few state legislatures or tried to. What was their response to this?
Yeah, I reached out to Washington GOP state chairman Jim Walsh for his thoughts on it. And he said, he agrees with the prospect of identifying Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And he thought it very interesting as well that Trump then brought up potential, RICO charges, racketeering charges against the groups that fund Antifa. So it's going to be interesting to see if this goes anywhere. But yeah, that was a kind of a huge win for us as an organization, right? For the Center Square. And it was our reporter based in DC, Sarah Roderick Fitch, that was able to get that question in the Oval Office, which I'll remind folks that are watching this, we weren't invited to the party before this second Trump administration, when he kind of opened up the doors to more independent media access to organizations like the Center Square. We're certainly not a small independent media outlet, but the opportunity to be there and to ask those questions, is something that wouldn't have happened except for this kind of change in media access policy under the Trump administration. But all that to say, it was very interesting. And anybody who's been in the Northwest for any length of time, especially if you were around in 2020, knows what happens with Antifa and the fact that they have been funded, paid agitators, as President Trump called them. The damage is not insignificant. The injuries to police officers during those 2020 protests, I covered those as a radio reporter at the time, and there was a lot of damage done.
Yeah, and Trump kind of spoke to that in his comments with our reporter in the White House, kind of just saying, referencing instances of bottles and rocks being thrown at police officers, not only in Seattle, but across the country during the George Floyd riots and since then as well. The paid agitators comment really struck me because that's something that we've heard over and over again over the years, whether it be with Antifa or nonviolent protests. I mean, we can look back a few months to say the No Kings protest that made a lot of people nervous ahead of that ended up largely peaceful, but people in Seattle and across the country were being paid hundreds of dollars to participate in this. I mean, from a camera viewpoint, it looks like, wow, you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people showing up in droves for these protests. And sure, that may be true in some light, but you also have to recognize that we don't know how many of these people are being paid to show up. And when that happens in the case of Antifa and these other groups that do perpetuate violence and violent rhetoric, it raises the stakes here.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So did Walsh say that he thinks that Antifa are paid agitators too? Is he seeing this in the States? What did he say specifically?
Yeah, he absolutely agrees that they are paid agitators. And he and I have spoken about that before. You get and he attended, you recall after the No Kings protest and the arrests, Cal Anderson, 3 days later, there was the counter protest, faith-based groups that showed up in front of Seattle City Hall. And Representative Walsh was at that event, and I spoke to him about the folks that were there because it was a bunch of trans activists, folks from the LGBTQ community that disagree with these faith groups that are pushing back on that agenda. And we were kind of surrounded, just as a member of the media, as we attempted to leave that event. Police were trying to make a clear path for us to get back to our vehicles parked a few blocks away. But there was certainly, a lot of pressure from some of these groups. Now, I don't know if these were local folks, if these were Antifa folks that were bussed in, if anybody there was a paid agitator. I don't know that for certain, but I can tell you it's a very uncomfortable feeling to be have to get a police escort basically back to your vehicle, or told don't go that way. And I didn't have anybody spit in my face, but I did have people call me some pretty vile things, just as a member of the media to cover the event. And, back in 2020, remember the Chaz or Chop Zone or whatever, and I included this in my article. Those folks came in from outside the area, and many were saying, yeah, I came in here because of what's happening in Seattle. They wanted to be part of the movement. The idea was, they were going to push back, defund the police. That was the beginning, that whole thing, right? And the Chaz or Chop Zone there, let's see, the Capitol Hill occupied protest, or Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. So it became Chop or Chaz, whichever one you liked better. But they argued that, having armed officers in the area, wasn't a good idea. And they, basically, recall Seattle police ended up abandoning the East Precinct. It was taken over. That whole area was taken over by those groups for several weeks. And it led to the defunding movement in Seattle and other cities. And dangerous fallout from what began the Summer of Love, right? Remember that?
Yeah. Not only did police kind of have to abandon the precinct there in Seattle, but I mean, a teenager died in the Chop Autonomous Zone. And, people think of Capitol Hill as being the more LGBTQ friendly area of the city. And it definitely is, but that doesn't mean that it's free of violence or these groups taking advantage of nationwide unrest, especially during these huge events, whether it be the George Floyd protests or the No King's Day rallies or others like these. And you spoke to it a little bit. I mean, it's hard to differentiate between these groups, whether it be, just a LGBTQ activist or a city resident or someone from Antifa or these other groups. I mean, when you're there, it's hard to tell the difference. I mean, sometimes you'll get a few of them that are dressed in that clad black, are covered in dark face masks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you might think, that might come to mind as being Antifa, and I think it does for a lot of people. But I'm really interested to see if the Trump administration does pursue charges, and they brought up RICO charges for these groups. I mean, how they would go about it. Because I mean, on the street level, like we just said, it's really hard to say definitively who is who. I mean, you could kind of say, yeah, based off the public perception and things that we've been told in the past, this looks like that. But I really wonder if they're going to try to hit it from the top down and try to go after the people leading these groups, and not only leading these groups, but the people funding these groups. Because that's what it really goes back to.
I mean, right. You've heard that. I mean, and there's lots of organizations that he funds and things that he's involved in. He doesn't come right out and say, yeah, I'm paying people to go protest and to be, agitators or be violent. But it's a scary situation in the, post assassination of Charlie Kirk. There are folks that think violence against what they consider to be hate speech. They called Charlie Kirk, one that was espousing hate speech. That's a whole argument for a different day. I tend to disagree, but folks that believe that violence is appropriate in response to that, those are the kind of folks that are coming out to some of these protests. And when they're all dressed in black and their face is covered and they've got a gas mask on and they've got pockets full of something, it's a scary environment. And if you are an organization paying people to go and act that way, peaceable protest is one thing. And of course, everybody agrees that, we don't want to crack down on that. People have a right to freedom of expression. You have a right to show up and counter protest. But if in fact they can follow the money trail, and I have no doubt if Trump attempts to do that, he can find the money trail and figure out if in fact it's George Soros or some other, left-wing extremist organizations that are funding these groups, busing them in across the country, as we've seen, then, it would make sense to be cracking down on that, or at least attempting, to whether it's RICO charges or some other, applicable law to go after that. I would think that there's probably going to be a lot of public support for that.
Well, not just physical injuries such as broken bones, lacerations, eyes being damaged, but also more importantly, equally as important, I should say, is the stress put on these officers. PTSD was a significant issue that we're dealing with, and that still plays out years later. So just imagine that you're a police officer and you're trying to serve the community, and you're a professional public servant, and you're on the line holding the mob back. No pun intended, but my podcast is Hold the Line, and that podcast name was spawned out of Antifa's lawlessness because we were on the line between what is right and what is wrong, good and evil. They, obviously Antifa representing evil, but they would say the most vile things, even to African American officers, basically telling them to go back to their own countries, that they were Uncle Toms. They would dox us. They would know everything about our families, where they went to school, where our spouses worked. They did everything they could to undermine our authority and hit us morally with why were we even police officers in the first place. These people are vile, and they should be treated as such. They should be held accountable. So I'm so glad that they're finally going after the resources that people are propping up these Antifa thugs with: money, assets, influence, legal cover. Let's go after it all, because it's about time the reasonable community has a voice. And I believe that this moniker of calling them domestic thugs from a federal level gives our communities hope and gives the law enforcement that protects our nation on a day-to-day basis somewhat of a positive moral outlook on the future, and recaptures some of that anti-police sentiment that has crushed not just the profession across the nation, but more importantly, the public safety conversation on a national level. It's time we get our streets back, and this act of calling them out for what they are, I think, is the positive step in the right direction.
The state forecasting to run out of money potentially as early as 2027, not very far off. And the fiscal crisis potentially being far worse than that because of our state's pension system and some shenanigans maybe by state lawmakers during the 2025 session that may end up coming back to bite us. So set the stage for us, TJ.
Yeah, so to be fair and start off, Washington State's pension system is actually one of the best funded pension systems in the country. Compared to other states, it really stands out. But what happened is it struggled for years to get the unfunded liability under control, and it's primarily due to two retirement plans that were closed in the 70s because they were so lucrative for people who were enrolling. It was not fiscally sustainable. But for years, those plans were the ones where they were struggling to close the unfunded liability. And the way the system works is you have the employees who contribute into the system, but then you also have the employers, which are state agencies, and they get that money from the state operating budget. And for a very long time,
that's the taxpayer.
Yes, taxpayers. So the taxpayers are paying for that section of the pension system. It's on top of the salaries of the people who are contributing. So they're actually paying both ways. Good point. So the problem is that the state legislature gets to decide how much they're going to contribute into the system. And so one of the ways that they can control that is the assumed rate of growth for the investments. So all the pension money goes into these investments that the state investment board oversees. And so they're looking at ways to obviously get a return on investment. And for a while, it was actually, to be clear, the higher assumed rate of growth, the less the state has to contribute because that extra money is coming in from the investments. So the high assumed rate of growth, then they don't have to put in as much. Well, what happened in the 2000s is that they stopped contributing, and you had the dot-com bubble burst. Then you had the Great Recession, which completely threw everything out of whack. And so by 2015, the state pension system had a $10 billion liability. So that was 10 years ago.
They stopped paying into it for a number of years because it was in good shape. And then we had some economic issues.
They assumed the rate of return would be a certain amount. So why put it into the system? Or they just didn't want to put the money in because they had other priorities. So what the state legislature did this year during the legislative session is they passed a bill that changes the assumed rate of return from 7% to 7.25%. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot mathematically if you just look at the numbers, but it's kind of like the interest rates. You can change an interest rate by 1%, and that can have a huge impact on the amount that you either have to pay for a mortgage or you have to put into a system. So in this case, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that they did not have to put into the state operating budget to contribute to the pension plans. So I talked to one I talked to a policy analyst who covers the pension system named Ryan Frost. And what he told me was kind of scary. He said they didn't contribute because they didn't have the money. So they put in a more optimistic view of the investments to avoid having to contribute. The problem is, and this is something he explained and warned even during the legislative session, if we get to say 2027, 2028, 2029, and the assumed rate of growth doesn't match what actually happened, we're now going to go back to an unfunded liability.
Right.
And for context, we're on track to have the pension system fully funded by 2027. Now, something to keep in mind, that doesn't mean all the money's there. It means that based on actuarial assumptions, it's fully funded. So it's not like all the money because obviously people are going to continue to enter the system, leave the system because they pass away. And then, so it doesn't mean that the money is actually there. It means that based on their actuarial assumptions and the assumed rate of return, they're going to have the money that they need, but that's based on assumptions. So,
and probably important quickly to back up when we're talking about the pension system. Give me the size and scope and landscape of the employees that we're talking about. These are public employees. These are our teachers, but others, right? Who are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's any public state employee, like firefighter. You have police officers and that kind of stuff. There's anybody who works for the state and qualifies for the pension.
All the different agency employees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And there's, I believe, 88,000 people on these who are currently collecting money from the pension plans. So that's another thing. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that they have to make as part. I'm not an actuary, obviously I'm an investigative reporter, but even the lifespan of the retirees affects their planning. They have to account for that. So
that's changed in the last 20 years, right?
Yeah, this is kind of an aside, but let's say that they came up with some medical invention that allowed the average lifespan for people to increase by 6 years. That's something that they have to incorporate into their assumptions of, hey, our assumption is that the average person is going to stop taking out of the system by this date, but that's by this age because they've passed away. But now the lifespan's increasing, so we have to pay more. And so there's all these little things that could come out or occur. I mean, if there's a recession, then the rate of return isn't going to be met. The state doesn't have to put in, and that's going to be the issue, is if they do need to increase contributions to restore the solvency of the pension system, they don't. They're on track to run out of money by 2027. So it's really a gamble that they took in that sense, because if they had just kept the system as is, then there wouldn't be a whole lot of risk. And you would have what they've done is take a well-funded system and try to, one would argue, play around with the numbers to divert that money elsewhere. Because we're talking several billion dollars through 2030. We're talking several billion dollars that they are not putting into the system. And that money's going elsewhere. But on top of that, our state has just passed the largest tax increase in state history. Their revenue levels are higher than they've ever been, but they're still on track to run out of money. Now add on top of that a recession, and then you add on top of that the fact that the pension system's actuarial assumptions don't match up. I mean, it's just one example of where this is really it's the potential. It's not that it's actually going to happen, but the potential is if a recession occurred or, God forbid, a depression, the state's fiscal could face a massive fiscal crisis, and it's not something you can solve overnight. And just by either you'd have to cut a massive amount of state spending on top of the fact that they've already passed enough taxes to where a lot of CEOs are crying foul.
Right.
So that's the context of this. If this was during times when they had a lot of money in their reserves and they, hadn't passed all these taxes that they could use as a potential revenue source, and then, this is not occurring during a recession, right?
Well, and I recall sitting in hearings during this year's session when this was being discussed, TJ, and, sort of caution over here going, okay, you're going to assume a whole, quarter of a percentage point, gain from what's already in there. So you don't have to put more in now. That's really, really risky. And it seemed like no matter how many folks that are the experts in this were sounding that alarm, that majority Democrats weren't willing to listen to that.
Yeah, the Office of the State Actuary they did give a caveat, though they didn't testify because they don't take sides on bills like that. But another thing to keep in mind is if we have, as we have had recently, I mean, I believe it's been 100, I'm not going to give a number, but we've had a significant increase in inflation over the past decade. And obviously, since a lot of these pension plans were set up, what you could have on top of that is if you have inflation, you could have people who have gone to the state legislature and say, we need you to increase the cost of living adjustment so that we get paid more because of inflation. So you have that on top of that. So not only do you have to fund the pension plan, you're going to have pressure from these retirees.
Yep.
Yeah. To fund into the system so that they can, maintain their cost of living, amount. So
and that's all on taxpayers. So
right.
the state employees, who in Washington we know are fairly compensated, in my opinion, for what they do. Hard work, great work. But so now we're paying as taxpayers a heck of a lot more money just for their salaries. And then for their employer, state agency, that we also fund to add additional money to the pension program. And then assuming things don't pan out in these next few years with the pension program, they're going to come back and say they need more money to feed back into the system that they failed to invest in properly.
Yeah. And I doubt that there's the political will in this state at this time for them to react by saying, we're going to increase the minimum age that you can retire and start collecting out of the system.
Like the rest of us in the private sector have to do. But no, that's not going to happen for.
I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers specifically for this story. I might actually do that for a follow-up story, but I'm curious what the minimum age is for people to retire, because I've heard from other parts of the country, there's people who are able to retire in their 40s or in their 50s, which, and what that means is they can take out of the system and start living off their pension if they want to, or they can go retire officially and go get another job that coincidentally also has a pension. I mean, that's another thing to take into consideration. It's a double
dip. That can't be legal.
I've heard of examples of that, but I can't confirm. But again, they can also go work another job, maybe in the private sector or as a consultant or as a 1099er, self-employed, but they're still collecting the pension. And, how much of that, what percentage of that, is of the salary when they retired. So it's really a question. And, they have the investments going on so that they're getting the money from elsewhere, but it's still taxpayer dollars, like you said.
It is. And it's an increasing burden on the rest of us that don't work, in public service, if you will. But, well, this is fascinating. It's scary stuff, TJ. I'm glad you're covering it. It's going to be interesting to see if it even comes up and is addressed during the, upcoming 2026 session. I was looking at the dates for that. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's less than 4 months till session begins again. And I've barely recovered from 20.
Well, I mean, with this, the State Economic Revenue Forecast Council's revenue report update is coming out September 23rd. So
yep.
That's going to be very critical it's going to tell us exactly what kind of legislative session we're walking into.
Well, and I've had folks telling me it's going to be as ugly as you can imagine what comes out next Tuesday. So I know we're going to be all over that. I know you will be. Yeah. So very good. Thank you, TJ. I really appreciate this. For folks that want to check out TJ's article, it's at thecentersquare.com/Washington, along with our Center Square investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. I'm Carlene Johnson. This has been Washington in Focus.